is teeming with innovation as new business models reinvent every industry. Inside Analysis is your source of information and insight about how to make the most of this exciting new era. Learn more at InsideAnalysis.com.
InsideAnalysis.com.
And now, here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
Yes, indeed, folks. Welcome to the future. Back to the future, right? Here we are in 2023, hurtling forward. I think the quickening has already happened because things are going really, really fast these days. What do they say? The days are long, but the weeks are short. And we're already knocking on the door of halfway through 2023. I'm not sure I believe it, but here we are. And folks, we have an all-star cast for you today, thanks to our good friend David Sweenor, who decided to rally some troops and get a whole group of evangelists together. So we've got David Sweenor, Shawn Rogers, and Nick Jewell, an all-star cast of analytics and AI experts. We're going to talk about the business value, defining the business value of analytics and AI. Well, it's a much different story now than it was 5 and 10 years ago. Pretty much everyone understands in the business world that analytics is really important. How you get there, what you do with it, how quickly you leverage the power of analysis, that's a different story. A lot of companies are doing real-time optimizations now using analytics and AI. We're going to talk about artificial intelligence as well, which is an interesting side track. In many cases, it tries to do the same things that analytics does. And ideally, you want to kind of blend these two worlds and get the value of AI for pattern recognition, pattern matching, for understanding what's going on in complex scenarios. And then, of course, analytics, running the numbers, understanding why that's happening. Really, if you get these two together, you can get a really clear picture of what's going on in your business. And that's going to help you regardless. So it's very good to have these technologies. Exactly which ones you choose will depend upon your budget, of course, and your use case. But these folks know a lot about all that stuff. So David Sweenor, since it was your idea, I'll hand it off to you to kick us off here. What do you think the business value is of analytics and AI, and what do you do to evangelize all that?
Well, Eric, hey, thank you for having us on. Totally appreciate it. And, I thought of this topic, a lot of the clients and prospects we talk to, organizations have made a significant investment in data. And so we've done a great job of ingesting, collecting, and storing data. And you've spent, millions and millions of dollars on these things, companies have. But when you get to the analytics side of it, it doesn't have the rigor. The number one question that I get is, how do we measure that value? How do we measure the ROI? Most of the clients and customers that I speak with anyways, they don't know how to articulate that beyond personal productivity. So we saved some time. They don't know how to tie it back to specific business KPIs. And so, I thought it would be great to have Nick Jewell and Shawn Rogers here and to discuss this topic. It's at the top of minds for all of the clients I speak with.
Yeah. And Nick Jewell, I think we'll bring you in next. You've been doing this for a long time and you have your own company as well. And we should point out that David has a whole book series, Tiny Guides, I think he calls them. We'll talk about that in a minute too. But you also have your own enterprise where you're trying to educate people about the value of analytics, right? Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Eric. Thanks for having me on the show. I get to moonlight as the co-founder of a really cool little analytics upskilling startup that we call datacurious.ai. We're teaching thousands of students across the world, the benefits of analytics automation and really data literacy to reach their goals. And we'll dive into this more, I'm sure, during the conversation today. I just wanted to throw out there to start with, one of my highlights of my career was getting to interview Billy Beane, who was the general manager over at the Oakland A's, the baseball team, made famous by not being Brad Pitt, obviously, in the movie Moneyball. And the idea of value in that film was all about trying to find cheap baseball players that could get on base really easily. If you got on base, you scored runs, you had a good chance to win the game. So I think when we talk about finding value in analytics and AI, we can turn back to those ideas of big data, maybe from a decade ago, the big data Vs. You're not going to find value in volume anymore. I think the cloud service providers have probably got that one sewn up. you're probably not going to find it in variety necessarily anymore. A lot of work that I've done over the last couple of years with one of the more niche players in the analytics space, a company called Incorta, is really starting to build out the concept of a data lakehouse that gives us so much more flexibility than maybe we saw from traditional data warehouses. But later on in the conversation, I'd love to dive into the topic of that other V, the idea of velocity. I think there's a lot of room for differentiation in that area.
Velocity, volume, variety. These are the three V's that they talked about. And veracity is a fourth V that came into the equation. That's not something that ChatGPT is too good at. Shawn Rogers will bring you in on that. It's good at lots of things, but the veracity, not so much.
I wanted to be the first person to say ChatGPT. I thought there was a prize involved. But I think right now we're at an interesting inflection point. Right now, it feels to me like it did when the internet arrived for the public, for the consumers, for mass adoption. And suddenly things like generative AI are in the public eye. And I mentioned in the pre-call, my family had a wedding this weekend. I had two people ask me about ChatGPT. They were not the normal persona I expected to hear from on that topic. And it's always interesting to see what we all know collectively as not a brand new technology. AI has been around for decades, but it is really, gaining some interesting traction. The public stuff is great. I think the more interesting things are happening in the enterprise. And I agree with, what Nick just said a moment ago about velocity. How fast can you make a decision? How accurate is the decision you're making? Can you automate that decision? And then there's architectural challenges. Can you move that decision outside of your IT data center? And can you get it on a device to make a decision? Can you get it out to the edge of your business world and so on? So there's countless topics for us to discuss here, but it is kind of fun. And it has that feeling that definitely reminds me of all of the disruption when the world discovered the internet, which had been around for a while. As we all know, but it was this brand new thing in the 90s where everybody thought this was this classic brand new toy. I just feel like I see the same thing with AI and especially large language models and generative and so on. So yeah, it'll be a fun topic to explore.
Yeah, and the costs have really come down now. That's partially because of open source technology. It's partially because of the cloud. It's partially because of a company called Amazon that really baked into their corporate DNA this trajectory of bringing costs down over time. That was never a thing before that I recall. I mean, people would lower the cost of things as commodities became more prevalent, but the fact that they really baked that into their approach and their mission, I'll throw it to David Sweenor first. I think that's one of the reasons why costs have really come down and the cloud has become such a prevalent force in our lives these days. What do you think, David?
Yeah, I think that cost, piece is very interesting to me. And, to mention something that, Shawn had said, this waste that's in the analytics process. And I think this is where companies can tie this back to ROI. If I look at an analytics process, it starts, you have some sort of business event. You need to prepare the data to get it analytics ready. You have to complete the analysis. You need to make a business decision. And then you need to take business action. And if you look across that spectrum, there's data latency, there's analytics latency, there's decision latency, and there's action latency. So I think these things, that if you can compress this cycle, that's where companies are going to get that value. So that's that. I think there's a lot to be learned that if you just take sort of a process approach to this, it's not just doing analytics for the sake of analytics. You have to take that business event and tie it to business action.
No, I agree with that. And, we talk about big events. We've had lots of disruptions in the last few years. We had, it really started in the previous administration here in the States with tariffs on China, which no one had ever done before like that. And that threw the supply chains off. And then, of course, COVID comes around as a huge disruption. And that really made us focus on, I think, the power of analytics, because we also had to really focus on workflows and processes and how to get to data and how to do things. And a lot of people figured out, hey man, we have to change how we're doing things. We have to take sort of an API first strategy, maybe, whether it's security or just network connectivity or remote working. All that stuff kind of just threw the apple cart sideways. And I think we learned a lot from that. Nick, Jewell, what do you think?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I'm not sure how it affected you folks over in the US, but that big tanker that blocked up the Suez Canal made everybody panic over here, certainly in Europe, because the supply chains broke. We realized we didn't have that resilience across the board. So putting in data programs, analytics programs, getting to AI programs so that you could start to suggest alternate routes, alternate suppliers, ask more of those what if questions, more sophisticated analytics became priority number one. So I think over the last few years, obviously the large shock of COVID has made data and analytics forefront in the minds of the public, the media, governments around the world. But I think that real-time element, when things like supply chains get threatened, is such an opportunity for more advanced analytics to enter our lives in a beneficial way.
Yeah, and I think the AI really comes in, machine learning comes in handy with things like supply chain, because a traditional relational database, you can get some analysis of product amounts and locations and things, but you really kind of need more of a graph technology, and you need some AI to be able to run all sorts of different simulations. All right, what if we do this? What if we do that? What are the costs going to be? You know, in the old days, 20 years ago, you would just kind of think about it and take your best shot. I mean, you might have some decent software you're using. SAS, of course, has been doing cool stuff for a long time, SAS, out of Cary, North Carolina. But Shawn Rogers, I'll throw it over to you. I think what Nick is talking about, these disruptions really led to a keen focus on different ways of solving problems. And I think that led to a boom in AI and machine learning. What do you think?
Well, I think it was certainly a cause of it, but we've seen this a couple of times when these big disruptions come along. For those that we've all been in this business a long time, the financial dip that we saw in 07, 08 disrupted data, changed data for companies. And then of course the chain reaction on up changed the analytics. The big ones that we're talking about now, I have asked numerous customers, you know, especially in the executive ranks, how dramatically did your data change in March of 2020? And you don't get a clear answer because everyone was so busy trying to fight the higher level issues of how do we shift our marketing messages? What words don't we use? Do we want to invest here or there? A lot of companies didn't notice how dramatically things were evolving and changing quickly. And supply chain's a great example. E-commerce is another one. The big companies that quote unquote did so well during COVID were not as prepared as they probably should have been. You guys remember early days, Zoom struggled as they were growing. There was growing pains with other companies that were filling these gaps. And so understanding the dynamics of your data and how you're applying AI to it, models that worked on March 1st did not work on March 31st. They were not performing at the level they needed to. And so that takes you to some of these other big topics that I'm hoping we'll touch on, like model ops and data ops, and how do you bring it up to that next level and provide the scale that's required, but also the operational scale that's required. So that you can be nimble and so on. So yeah, these big disruptors, even, natural things, right? Natural catastrophes and so on, shift data all over the place and then affect models and affect the interaction of those models. So
yeah, and we really we'll talk about automation too. And automation is something that is always helpful if you do it correctly. You have to be careful about what you automate, because you can automate a crap process and then get a really crappy process and get very unhappy customers. I mean, I've seen this stuff happen, and marketing automation is hard. I was talking to a guy who's been in the industry for a long time, and he told me, because we were talking about HubSpot, I think, and I just said, from my experience, it is really hard to map out multi-touch strategies using even something like HubSpot because of so many exceptions. There are so many cases where someone's going to go outside that perceived decision tree, and the automation is going to fail when that happens. So you have to think through all these little bits and pieces, and it's hard. And he said, yeah, it's taken us about a year.
yeah.
So you got a team together. It takes a year. I mean, these days, like, well, it takes a year. What are you building a data warehouse there? Well, that's what he told me how long it used to take to build data warehouses. But the point is that it's hard, but you still have to do it. I mean, automation is going to be a crucial success factor, whether that's for data ingest, data cleansing, data provisioning, or whatever. All along that value chain, you want to be automating whatever you can, right, David?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's the power. I have this, theory on AI. It's, data plus analytics plus automation. That's my sort of basic definition. Now, I think, people will certainly could argue with that, but I think that's what it boils down to. And so automate, to your point, automating a crappy process, you can just make bad decisions faster. So that's not the right way. I think what people forget to do is reimagine their process. Is there a better way to do something? I think where most organizations fall down is, hey, we got a prediction. I can predict something a week, a day, a minute, whatever, into the future, but their business isn't agile enough to act upon that insight, or that they can make a decision, but they can't, the systems are they're fragile. And so this ability to take action as a result of a prediction, that's where I think a lot of companies fall down. They can't act upon it because their business is relying on things that they're manual processes. They're not automated, and companies struggle there.
Yeah, well, and there's a speed to insight and a speed to action that matters. Think call centers, think point of purchase, things of this nature. The companies, and like some of the telcos were good about this early in the game, delivering a customer value score to the person on the front on their screen so they can see, hey, don't waste your time with this person. He's always late on his bills. He might churn next week. Don't worry about that person so much. Whereas a high value customer, but you have to get that insight to the person right at the time when they're on the phone. So that takes a lot of engineering to make sure you get it right. So you got to do the analytics, you got to do the automation, you got to do the engineering. All these things have to come together for it to work just right. Correct, Nick, Jewell?
Well, absolutely. And I think this is where I have a little bit of a personal bee in my bonnet around some of the concepts in the modern data stack, where, we're entering data into these large, often legacy systems like ERP systems, big CRM systems, and the whole infrastructure, the whole machinery that's in place to move that data, to ingest it, to clean it, to prepare it, and then to get it into a model so that somebody sitting there with a customer can make the right decision. That takes too long. There's too many touches. If it was a kitchen, you'd have had 50 fingers on your food at this point, and you just can't get to that data fast enough. So I think there's a bit of a myth that something like a modern data stack solution solves every problem. We really need to be very careful about how we do transformation of data as we lift it from these source systems and get it into the systems of insight. And I think there's a lot of work we can still do to improve that process.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. One of the analysts I've had on the show many times, Rick Sherman, he jokes he doesn't like the modern data stack. He says usually it's glued together with a couple of lines of code somewhere, and it's pretty darn fragile. And fragility is not what you want in a data world where you're trying to maintain the tension, if you will, from source to target. You don't want to have to be jumping 2, 3, 4, 5 different systems, because guess what? Any one of those systems going slowly breaks the whole chain, right? A chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And that, I think, is the Achilles heel of the modern data stack as we see it today. They're going to be tightening that stuff up, I'm sure, over time. But folks, don't touch that dial. We're talking to 3 experts. I can't believe segment 1 is already gone. We'll be right back. You are listening to Inside Analysis.
Welcome back to Inside Analysis. Here's your host, Eric Kavanaugh.
Yes, indeed. Folks, take us to the future where ChatGPT doesn't hallucinate. I love that they came up with that term, hallucinations. That's pretty funny. It will make stuff up, folks. And basically, ChatGPT is large language model. It's a predictive engine. It's designed to predict the words that it thinks you want to hear based upon the prompt you give it. But I wanted to get back to this whole concept of speed and what has to be real time and what doesn't have to be real time. And someone who knows a lot about that is Shawn Rogers. So Shawn, from Bark these days, Bark Research, tell us about this collision of value.
Well, it's this idea of, not everything has to be real time or right time. I think all too often we get distracted by our ability to do cool things, and then we think that it has to be applied to everything we're doing. And I think like the big data phenomenon kind of taught us that. We started off with everybody has to have Hadoop. My Hadoop has to be bigger than your Hadoop, and I would like a purple Hadoop because my competitors have a blue one. And they tried to do everything in it. And then they quickly found out that it's applicable to certain workloads. And I think the same thing happens here around the value of AI and the value of automation. You've got to apply it to the right circumstance, the correct workloads. A friend of mine, Dr. Richard Hackathorn, has published an awful lot of work on this for many years about the intersection of where the value is and the timing of a decision. If the timing is too long, you miss that value window. And you give a great example of that a minute ago, call center interactivity and things of that nature. It's all about bringing the decision and the time it takes to make that decision to the highest value point. And it's not for everything you do, but now there's new strategies, moving your analytics to the data instead of the data to the analytics. Those types of finesse sophistication strategies are allowing companies to meet that mark. And it's especially important around new, like modern data stacks that Nick just, we've agreed, or they can be kind of fragile. So you can't try to do it for everything. Do it for the right stuff, and then make sure you're hitting that target of time and value.
Yeah, well, that's a great point, right? Make sure you're hitting the target. You always want to be focused on the business value, and the use cases really matter. And there are lots of use cases for AI these days. Healthcare is a really big one, and population health, for example, can be really aided by being able to analyze data at scale. I'm actually talking to the chief analytics officer from CBS. She's going to speak at an event with me for Reuters in November, and she was talking about how they're using AI and analytics to be able to do sentiment analysis across thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of comments on YouTube and Instagram and Twitter and places where people do throw their opinions into the pool. Well, I mean, they're fun to read sometimes, but to get meaningful value out of them, that takes some pretty serious text analytics work to identify the word clouds, identify the cohorts, who are these different people, what are the demographics we care about. But she's telling me that they are intently focused on that day after day after day. And that's a pretty interesting use case in and of itself. Nick, Jewell, what do you think about that, or some other good use cases for AI?
Well, absolutely. My mind was drawing back to some work I did a couple of years ago with the Path organization out of San Francisco, which does a lot of work with the Gates Foundation to sort of, try and spread as much goodwill as they possibly can with the combination of data and boots on the ground to actually solve problems like eradicating malaria. Another really simple example in this area was during COVID, governments were trying to give aid to the most needy people in those countries. And one great example is a program called Novesi, which was out of Togo, a very small country, over in Oceania. And basically, they wanted to give out aid. They really struggled to work out who needed the aid the most. They didn't have a really good socioeconomic registry across the country. So as we were talking about earlier, they took really interesting sources of data, IoT data. They took satellite images. They took mobile phone metadata, the information about the calls rather than the calls themselves, to actually identify the poorest geographic regions, the poorest mobile subscribers based on their behavior, and could actually target the groups that were most at risk. And they actually managed to hit the 29% most poorest economic groups in that country as a result of using these modern data sources with advanced machine learning models in ways they just couldn't have dreamed of just a few years before.
Wow. And, you brought up something that I think is absolutely fascinating, and maybe I'll bring David to comment on that. And then Shawn, is this wealth of information sources that we have these days, IoT in particular, is so powerful because you can track things and you can understand the movement of people, of objects in a factory, for example, even footfall to be expected at shopping malls based upon the traffic coming into the city that morning. These are real use cases that some very forward-thinking companies have now put into play, and that can be very, very compelling because now we're leveraging what I call real-world data at scale. And I think we're still in the period of time of trying to reconcile what we thought was the case with what we're now seeing is the case. But David Sweenor, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think, we're all walking IoT devices these days,
Yeah, that's right.
cell phones, and they're in our car. It brings up an interesting question to me, though, is, who owns this data? Are there concerns about privacy and security? And, what is that limit? We've certainly seen that big tech companies, they're not going to police themselves. I think, even, Google had written that in their original research paper. If you're motivated by profit, that sort of always wins, right? And so now we got all these ads. So I appreciate the value of having all this data. I am a little concerned on sort of who owns it, who controls it, in that classic, who watches the watchman?
Yeah.
How do you, I would love to hear thoughts on that.
Maybe Sean Rogers, quis custodiet ipsos custodes. Who watches the
David
watchers?
knows this. In the last book I wrote, I have a chapter called "Innovative or Icky," and it was an entire chapter about, how far is too far? How far, when does insight and helpfulness or automated AI start to make you feel a little uncomfortable? And the weird thing is, or maybe not weird, it's a different threshold for everybody. All of us feel differently. I have expectations and I want AI to help me do things. I want Amazon to tell me what shirt to buy with whatever slacks I just got. I want to know what other people ordered when they went to that restaurant. I want all of those things. Some people don't care for that. And so I think one of the balances, to David's point about privacy and so on, is going to be how we're going to find what works for the majority, and giving controls to the others to limit their interaction. But I think just as the internet disrupted many years ago, or the World Wide Web, as we were talking during the commercial, it exposed this great technology that existed a long time ago. So I think there's going to be acceptance and rejection on these types of interactions. And it will also depend upon the theater you're in, right? If I'm in a business environment, I have an expectation that a BI tool is going to use AI to augment the view of the things that I'm doing. And I may not have that same level of expectation with my favorite sports website. So, I don't know, guys, does that make sense? I mean, do you see this collision of innovative and icky coming?
Yeah, absolutely, Sean. I think for me, this is something I've been watching for a couple of years as I watched Jeff Bezos get closer and closer to William Shatner's orbit, sending him into space, doing all that cool stuff. William Shatner has been sitting down with Amazon and basically pouring his heart and soul into a model right now, so that when he dies, you'll be able to talk to William Shatner. How close do we get to icky when you can do that with your mother, grandmother, significant other? That won't be that far away, right? It'll be David Sweenor as a service, and we'll be able to call and tap in on his expertise. But seriously, though, on this, we are talking about, I think, the need for privacy and ethics, but also synthetic data. I think when it comes to these niche, very sensitive areas where we do have privacy issues, healthcare data, finance data, we need to be investing more in topics like synthetic data production to be able to train these models on domain areas rather than necessarily just harvesting everyone's data for that purpose.
So I got an expansion for you on this one, Nick. I'm not sure you would have seen it on TV where you live. The CEO of OpenAI was in front of our Congress a week or so ago trying to teach all the 75-year-old senators what AI is, which should have been billed as a comedy show. But they did use a piece in that where the setup for part of the conversation was supposed to be one of the senators speaking, and his lips weren't moving and the words were coming. And it was a very eloquent paragraph of text, and it was AI voice copying. And so the AI was speaking in the senator's voice.
Wow.
And it went into the record here in Congress as AI gave testimony, kind of made a statement. So, wow. Where does that go? I think the senator did it because the AI was a lot more eloquent about AI than he was going to be. But it's this synthetic idea of synthetic data and AI, copying people's voices. I mean, there's gonna have to be some guardrails here pretty soon. So
this brings up an interesting question, though, Sean. So the U.S. has always sort of been behind, where Nick lives in the world in terms of regulations on AI and privacy. Now, if we step back, we say, okay, Europe has this sort of regulations. The U.S. has this sort of regulations. China, who knows what China is going to do? They have their own regulations. So is there what is that balance? Like, if we're really strict over here, not strict here, and you're doing something totally weird over here. I'm curious about, your thoughts on that.
You highlighted the balance, right? It's the extremes of both are going to be curtailing, and the inside lane, whatever that is. I had the privilege, David, when you and I worked together years ago, I was at the EU, and I got to have a conversation, gave a talk there about would the strict governance over AI and big data limit the ability for the EU to actually keep pace with crazy countries like the US, who were not really doing any guardrails at that point. And it was an interesting debate. And I can tell you, I had that conversation in 2016. I wrote the chapter in my book about innovative or icky in 2017. And we're not there yet. And then when something like ChatGPT shows up in the public market and is being adopted by college kids to do their homework and everybody else in kind of odd ways, it's just opening up. I think it's going to be a forcing factor, David, right? It's gonna make us find the guardrails, and it's going to make us identify that inner spot, because both ends of it probably aren't the way to go.
Yeah, no, these are really interesting points too. And Nick, I was talking to a guy from England. He runs an organization called the Data City, and they're doing some really cool stuff around transparency. And I'm pretty sure Shawn knows about my evangelism in the era of transparency, or in for transparency in federal spending, but also in corporate transparency. And he was telling me that in England, if you have over £1 million a year of revenue, you have to open your books, whether you're a public company or not. And I was like, that's pretty cool. I mean, I really like this focus on, especially again, as AI starts taking off and getting a life of its own and being able to imitate people extremely well. We need transparency, and we need trusted voices and trusted channels to be able to deliver trusted information. What do you think, Nick?
Well, absolutely. So I've done some work with a data science charity in the UK called DataKind, and we did a big hackathon all around exactly what you said. A company called Open Corporates opened the books on all the different companies that were based out of the UK, based out of the various communities in the islands around the UK. Jersey is a tax haven, for example, Bermuda and other areas like that. And we crawled that data looking for patterns, but without that transparency, none of that machine learning would have been possible. We built an amazing graph database that allowed us to capture who was opening serial companies day after day. Why were they doing that? We had a whole team of data journalists just to look into the things that the model produced. So transparency leads to some amazing benefits. But if I may, one last point around just the general concept of bias inside these models.
Yeah.
Myself and my co-founder a couple of months ago, just as GPT was really hitting the hype cycle, we did some frivolous tests, and we were like, tell me a joke about the Irish. GPT would give you a joke. Tell me a joke about the Polish. No problem at all. Give me a joke about the Chinese. I'm sorry, I'm an AI model. I can't do that. And there were certain countries where it was forbidden. And it was really interesting to see guardrails are obviously in place, but they're not applied consistently.
And I had this thought, because there is this big question, and I predict there are going to be some heavy duty legal battles going on in the very near future, going up against OpenAI and any of these large language models, because it seems to me you could create a machine learning algorithm to request text created by ChatGPT and then do a handful of exact phrase searches from that document to the interwebs to see, because it's getting this information from somewhere. So is it violating copyright? I have to believe that it is at some point, right? It can't, there are only so many ways to say things, which is why ChatGPT is even possible. But to me, that's a very interesting shoe yet to fall. What do you think, Shawn, real quick?
Well, I think some are doing it better than others. Bing, for instance, if you go there and use their system, they will give you footnotes at the bottom of the response, and they'll say, I pulled this segment from a report that was written, and one of the searches I did recently, it took me back to a report at TDWI, a renowned source, a respected source. I was happy to see that. I knew the man who it was an older piece of research. Philip wrote it, and so I felt good about that. So I think some of that transparency, Eric, you're going to start having to see that, like, hey, Shawn wrote 2 books, and here's the titles, and I would have liked to have known why Chat got one of my titles wrong and attributed me to a book I didn't write. So it's coming.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. These organizations are really moving quickly. So, I mean, really interesting things are happening right now. They're addressing a lot of these concerns. So it's going to get better, faster. We'll be right back. You are listening to Inside Analysis.
Welcome back to Inside Analysis. Here's your host, Eric Kavanagh.
All right, folks, back here on Inside Analysis, talking to an all-star cast of analytics and AI experts. Our good buddy Nick Jewell, dialing in from across the pond, David Sweenor from up in New Hampshire, I believe, north of here, and Shawn Rogers way out west in the Colorado regions. We're talking about the business value, and we should get back to that ROI. So I'll throw it over to David. I mean, clearly you can save time, you can do much more effective research, and it's also changing the mindsets about how you do things. But being able to define the specific value, that's always going to be hard. But if you can tie a decision to an analytic, for example, and then show, hey, this is why we sold that deal, that $1 million project. Well, that's the best kind of ROI where you can actually tie it to money coming in the door. What do you think, David?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wrote a blog that it's getting quite a bit of traction on this, and I call it the art of the AI KPI. So, I really think of this in sort of five different dimensions. So there's the business impact of data analytics and AI. So we can tie, are we getting more customers? Are we going to market faster? That's great. I think the second one is time from, data creation to insight and action. So we talked about that a little bit earlier. How can we compress that cycle so we can make decisions faster? I think the third dimension people can measure is data quality. How is your data quality? That if you have crappy data quality, you're not going to get great decisions. You can look at the impact on your organization. So data literacy levels within your organization, the more people that can participate in the data and analytics process within your organization, those companies outperform companies that have a lower percentage population. And the last one is really risk. You can measure risk of your AI application. So those are sort of the five sort of dimensions I tend to think about how companies can start to measure the value of their analytics investments.
Yeah, I like the data quality example. Nick, Jewell, I'll throw it over to you because, again, AI and machine learning, these are very good at tackling tedious tasks at scale. Very simple things that a human can usually do, but very, very, very slowly. And folks, anyone who out there in the enterprise world who thinks that your data quality is very, very good, all you got to do is ask someone to show you one database. Just pick any database at all and open it up to any page, and you're going to see problems. It's depressing, quite frankly. But these little algorithms, they can just kind of churn through this stuff. And what they can do is flag for you all the things that you can do to clean up. And you're starting to see this like in Google Sheets, for example. Domo is doing this. A bunch of vendors are now all offering these sort of recommendation engines. Hey, do you want to clean up your state characteristics in this column? Do you want to clean this up, clean that up? And a lot of times they're right. And I'm like, that's pretty good. Nick, Jewell, what do you think?
Well, absolutely. I think this actually touches on two of David's points. So I think you've got the essence of automation. So once you've identified a problem, how quickly can you get it out of a human's hands into the playbook that you run every single night, every single load? But also actually it goes after bottom line use cases. So cost savings, it could be, you improve your supply chain management because you fixed some of these lookup codes that are always causing the system to fail.
Right.
Bottom line stuff's all about going after friction within a business process. If you can oil that machine so it runs faster, you are going to make the case for analytic investment.
That's a great example. Shawn Rogers, I'll throw it over to you. There are lots of ways you can improve efficiency. Like Nick just said, just finding the lookup codes that are causing you trouble. Prioritization. This is something I came up with last year. I was trying to figure out what's a good methodology I can put in place to explain the importance of knowing what to do. And knowing what to do at any given moment, kind of a big deal. I mean, if you're a firefighter, it's pretty obvious what you do. You put the fire out. But for lots of other jobs, especially running small businesses, man, that you could be doing any number of things at any point in time. Where will you get the most value from it? I think AI can help in that category too. What do you think, Shawn?
Well, I think it's going to get us to a finish line a whole lot quicker than we used to be able to. In my role, I get to be with a lot of different software companies and get these kind of behind the scene briefings. And I spent a couple of days in Las Vegas a week or two ago with Informatica, for instance. They're automating an awful lot of the things that are around being able to be literate and understand your data, being able to have better data quality, and being able to leverage the metadata that exists in your environment in a way that you couldn't before. Kind of pulling everything from data catalogs all the way up to make sure that there's continuity between the systems and the stack that you're operating in. So I think it's one of the most disruptive automated aspects of data management that we've ever seen, and I think we're just going to keep seeing it get better and better and better over the coming year or so. And I think it's going to be extremely disruptive, but in a really positive way. So I talk about this idea of everything old is new again quite often. And by that I mean, MDM's been around a long time, data quality a long time. And projects got started and projects were abandoned. And a lot of times they were abandoned because someone saw another bright, shiny toy of technology that they wanted to go chase, and they shifted budget. It's the new opportunities that AI brings to data management as a foundational layer to better analytics and automated AI. It's incredible. And it's really exciting. So I think we're going to see a lot there. And to David's, first comment, is that where the value, is that where the return on investment is? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and also like one last question I'll throw out to the team here, and David, maybe over to you first about where these things are headed. And in my opinion, one of the most important things to note is that the value of AI, I think, is largely going to manifest in the form of suggestions. Hey, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And when that suggestion comes in some sort of enterprise portal where you're doing your work every day, well, guess what? The machine can track when you said yes, when you said no, when you went with certain suggestions. And then if you're selling goods, for example, you should be able to track that. I think you should raise the price 50 cents. Okay, let's do it. A month later, look, we made more profit. So we'll be able to calculate that ROI much more accurately in the future because of AI, because everything is captured in the cloud. David, what do you think?
Yeah, I certainly think rapid iteration is definitely something to keep an eye on. Where if I just was to look in the future, I think right now we're talking about mainly software and using it to make predictions and dashboards and things like that. I think where this will be heading is there's going to be more robotics out there. And, I'm going to just take an example. If you look at Japan, 30% of the population in Japan is over 65. So it has the oldest population on Earth, with the exception of Monaco. The median age is about 48.7, and it's the world's median age is 30.2. So there's a lot of elderly people that need help. They need help getting around. They need help getting things from the store. They need help with healthcare. They need companionship. And so I think we're going to see a lot of this really embedded in robotics that's going to help people for the better. And the other, I think, big area is physics-based AI. So right now, these algorithms spit out things without context to the environment. And if you can take a little bit about the environment, here's the guardrails, here's how this environment behaves and works. And if you think about process steps, these things are sort of connected, process step 1, 2, 3. I think this is where we're going to see AI. We're going to infuse it with physical system, the physics of it, and we're going to get better predictions there. That's sort of where I think AI is headed.
I like that. Better predictions. Nick, Jewell, closing thoughts from you where these things are headed?
Oh, fantastic. Well, Dave Sweenor went down the route of physics. I'm going to go back to math, all the way back to the beginnings. So I've been looking really closely into a thing called causal AI recently. So Eric, to your point about making better recommendations, the kind of classical statistics that we've used in advanced analytics for years, centuries really, are actually quite limited by what they can do. So you want to make a prediction, what happens when I raise the price by 3 times? Will people still buy it? It's actually incredibly hard for classical models to answer. So causal AI is all about really getting into this hard space of cause and effect. What would happen if I changed the price by 3 times? Would people still buy it? What happens is to find a relationship, between smoking and death. That was a question that was incredibly hard for traditional statistics to answer. There are some amazing startups in this space. There's a lot of work going on bringing in graph databases to map these causal models. I think we're going to see a, disruptive, staggering potential in this space.
Yeah, I like that staggering potential. Buckle up, Shawn Rogers. What do you think? 1 minute.
Last thing I'll add is I think going back to David's literacy idea of understanding the information that we're getting, I'm seeing a lot of the BI vendors bringing to market things like key drivers, right? So you can do the query, what did we sell in the Western region? And you can ask it a question of why sales are down. And now the systems are servicing, here's the 4 things and the number 1 key reason that this occurred. And it drives that literacy idea so that you can do more and get greater insights. And that's been coming for a while, but I think the new things that we're seeing with AI and ML are certainly going to drive it.
Yeah, I think so too. And these large language models going single tenants, right? Where you can basically have one and connect it to your information system. So you're not just plugging it into the greater large language model, which of course is a leaky way to give your trade secrets to everyone in the world who puts the right prompt queue in there. That is going to change things as well. That I'm hearing that's coming down the pike right now. But the cool thing is that the speed at which you can get answers these days is going to do wonders for the analytics industry, because we all know, we're in this business, we all know how exciting it is to figure something out, make a decision, and watch it work. It's amazing stuff, and many more people are going to do that because it's going to work a lot faster. Look these guys up on LinkedIn. We'll talk to you next time. You've been listening to Inside Analysis.